The Whitmore estate loomed over Charleston like a monument frozen in time. Red brick, white columns, windows that blinked in the sunlight like guarded eyes. The kind of house people whispered about on historic tours, not because of ghosts, but because of power. Inside, silence reigned, interrupted only by polished footsteps and the occasional echo of privilege. And through the front gate that morning walked someone the house wasn't ready for. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Clara Bennett stepped onto the gravel path, her suitcase light, her expression unreadable. She wore the uniform, black dress, white apron, just like the agency required. But there was a precision in her posture that didn't match the image. Her eyes scanned the structure like she was memorizing it, every arch, every door, every possible exit. Mrs. Keating, the head housekeeper, met her at the back entrance, efficient, composed, skeptical. She led Clara through the servant corridors, speaking with clipped formality. "We don't tolerate lateness, no personal calls, no idle talk with the family unless spoken to." Clara nodded silently, offering no more than what was required. That, too, was part of her plan. By midday, she had already completed her first tasks: laundry, silverware polishing, inventory. She moved through the house like someone who'd been in it before, though no one noticed. That's how she wanted it, to be invisible, to observe. Because this wasn't just a job, it was a return. Upstairs, Ethan Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks in front of a mirror that cost more than Clara's entire education. He was preparing for a charity gala, one of many events that filled his calendar, but never his life. He glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of movement below. A new maid. Something in the way she carried herself pulled his attention longer than it should have. "She's not your type," Caroline said, leaning against the doorframe with a glass of wine in hand. His sister always knew where his gaze went before he did. Too quiet, too self-possessed. Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure what it was, only that she didn't move like a stranger. That evening, Clara found herself alone in the library, dusting the shelves. Her hand paused over a book, Charleston's Founding Families. She pulled it out gently. Inside, names that echoed through. Her childhood stories, Rutherfords, Caldwells, Whitmores, and one name scribbled faintly in pencil in the margin of a family tree. Bennett. The lights flickered. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Clara quickly replaced the book and resumed her cleaning. Ethan passed by the door, slowing just a beat before continuing. He didn't speak, but he noticed the book out of alignment. That night, Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, holding a photograph, her mother, standing in front of the Whitmore estate, long before it belonged only to strangers. On the back, a handwritten note, "Find what was taken." Memories swirled in fragments, her mother's voice telling her about the summers in Charleston, the piano music, the statue in the garden, and then the silence, the sudden move, the name never spoken again. Clara's jaw tightened. She wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here for truth. In another room, Ethan poured himself a drink. He couldn't shake the image of her, the way she moved through the house like she'd memorized it. He flipped through his phone absently, stopping on an old family photo, a garden party, faces he barely remembered. In the background, a girl, out of place, dark-haired, watching from the shadows. He looked again. The face was blurry, but something about it felt familiar. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed midnight. The house creaked, and in the quiet, something shifted, not a noise, not a gesture, just an understanding. Two people in different worlds had noticed each other, and only one of them knew why. Morning settled over the estate like a veil, pale light filtering through sheer curtains, illuminating portraits that hadn't been dusted in years. Clara moved quietly through the drawing room, her eyes brushing over the faces on the walls, men in stiff collars, women with hollow gazes, generations of Whitmores watching over a house that no longer remembered who it had pushed out. She straightened, her frame slightly askew, and held its gaze a moment longer than necessary. In the dining room, Caroline Whitmore tapped her fingernails against her teacup. "You know," she said to Ethan without looking up, "that new maid, Clara, she's been asking about the garden statue." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And you find that suspicious?" Caroline smirked. "I find it peculiar. Most of them don't even notice it's there." Ethan didn't answer, but something in him stirred. He too had seen her lingering there. Clara, in fact, had returned to the garden that very morning. The angel stood just as she remembered from a childhood visit, one she was never supposed to recall. Her mother had brought her here under the guise of errands, but it wasn't about groceries. It was about connection, about showing Clara the ground where her blood had once mattered. She reached out now, fingertips grazing the moss-covered wing, feeling the echo of the past beneath her skin. Inside, Mrs. Keating watched from the kitchen window. "That girl," she muttered, half to herself. "There's something in her eyes, not fear, not even curiosity. It's memory." The cook beside her shrugged. "They're all the same, quiet at first, then they forget their place." But Mrs. Keating wasn't so sure. Clara didn't seem interested in climbing. She seemed interested in uncovering. Later, Ethan found himself in the library, pretending to read. His eyes kept drifting to the shelf where the genealogy books were kept. He stood, pulled one out, the same one Clara had touched. Inside, faint pencil marks beside the name, Lillian Bennett. He didn't know why, but the name tugged at something, a memory buried deep like a seed in dry soil. That evening, Clara was sent to refresh linens in the East Wing, the oldest part of the estate. Few guests stayed there now. The wallpaper peeled at the corners. The floor groaned in protest with every step. She entered the final room and stopped. The air felt different, heavy. She turned slowly, eyes landing on a dusty vanity. On it lay a cracked photograph in a silver frame. Two girls, one in Whitmore white, the other in a plain cotton dress. Her mother. Clara's breath caught. She reached for the photo, heart pounding. Behind it, a letter folded in halves. The ink had faded, but the name at the top was still visible. "To Lillian, from Margaret." She didn't read it, not yet. She slipped it into her apron just as a sound echoed behind her. Ethan. He stood in the doorway, eyes narrowing at the sight of her holding the photo. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, voice steady. He stepped inside slowly. "That's my mother's room. No one's supposed to clean here." Clara offered the photo back. "Then perhaps someone should have locked the door." A tense silence settled. Ethan looked at her, really looked. The way she held the frame, the way her fingers trembled just slightly. "Do you know her?" he asked. Clara didn't flinch. "No," she lied. But the house knew better. The walls breathed a little heavier. The past, awakened by her presence, refused to stay buried. That night she read the letter. It wasn't just a note. It was a confession, a love unspoken, a betrayal between families, a truth that could fracture everything. And Clara realized she wasn't just returning for justice. She was returning for the truth her mother never got to finish telling. Clara kept the letter beneath her mattress like a secret too fragile to fold again. She had read it 5 times already, and still the words struck her like a slow-moving fire. "Lillian, I never stopped waiting for you in the garden. I only stopped hoping you'd be allowed to come back." Signed, Margaret Whitmore. It wasn't formal, it wasn't even properly dated, but the paper was older than her, and the sentiment unmistakable. She moved through the house the next morning with a new silence, heavier, purposeful. The Burr estate had begun to feel like a performance stage. Every step, every word, every chore was theatre, and she was the only one reading the original script. The Whitmores had rewritten everything, even love. Ethan hadn't spoken to her since the East Wing. He watched her from a distance, increasingly unsure of his own instincts. He had always known when someone was hiding something, but this wasn't hiding. This was withholding. Clara wasn't afraid of him. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit. In the study, he turned back to the genealogy book, tracing the name, Lillian Bennet, with his finger. The surname had been crossed out in one revision, replaced, faintly, with Reed, a married name, a cover. He flipped to the acknowledgements. His mother had written annotations in pencil, soft as a whisper. One note read, Lillian, never left. She was erased. He leaned back, breath shallow. She had known, his mother had known, and she had left breadcrumbs, hoping someone would follow. Meanwhile, Clara ventured into the archives of the estate's cellar. Officially, she was organizing the seasonal decorations. In truth, she was hunting. The basement smelled of mildew and loss. Boxes lined the walls like graves, some marked with years, others with only symbols. She opened one and found an entire collection of invitations from the 1980s. Another, filled with ledgers and cancelled checks. Then a crate near the back, Bennet sealed. Her heart seized. She pried it open, breath catching with each rusted nail. Inside, letters, deeds, photographs, documents her family had once held. One photo showed her mother standing beside a younger Margaret Whitmore, both girls smiling, not as servant and heir, but as friends, equals, maybe more. A creak overhead. Clara froze. She pushed the lid shut, just as the door opened above. Footsteps echoed down the stairs. Ethan. He paused when he saw her, breath misting slightly in the cold air. I was looking for the Christmas ornaments, he lied. Clara stood still. Then you're 6 months early. He exhaled slowly, stepped deeper into the room. You weren't just cleaning that guest room, were you? She didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she reached for a small, folded document from her pocket and handed it to him. He opened it. His mother's handwriting. Again. If Lillian's daughter ever comes back here, give her this. She deserves to know where she comes from and why I failed her mother. His hands trembled. What is this? Clara's voice didn't waver. Proof. They stood in the dim light of the cellar, the dust swirling between them like memory in motion. He looked at her differently now, not as a curiosity or a mystery, but as a mirror. My mother loved her, he whispered. Didn't she? Clara nodded once. And your family destroyed her for it. The words fell heavy, but Ethan didn't deny them. He didn't walk away. He handed the letter back with care. Then we're both standing on the ashes of something we never understood. Later that night, Clara returned to the East Wing and placed the framed photo back on the vanity. She didn't belong in shadows. Not anymore. Her name wasn't a secret, and neither was her history. The house, for the first time in years, felt like it was listening. A low fog crept over the garden paths the next morning, draping the estate in a stillness that felt more like mourning than peace. Clara stood beneath the magnolia tree, her boots damp with dew, the cold curling around her neck like a warning. She looked again at the angel statue. Now not just a relic, but a marker. Her mother had brought her here once, years ago, just long enough for her to remember the smell of the grass and the feel of silence after being told they didn't belong. Ethan found her there just past 7. He said nothing at first, only watched her from a few feet away, his hands deep in his coat pockets. The letter she'd given him the night before was folded in his inside pocket, close enough to touch, but too volatile to hold for long. "You never asked me what I was doing here," Clara said finally. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," he replied. She turned slightly. "I'm not just here to remember. I'm here to make sure no one forgets again." Inside the house, Eleanor Whitmore poured tea slowly, the silence between each drip louder than the ticking of the clock on the wall. Caroline sat across from her, unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the window. "She's stirring up old names," Eleanor said without looking up. "They were always going to come back," Caroline replied. "It was just a matter of whose voice carried them." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "This house survived war, recession, and scandal. It won't fall. To a maid with a story." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "She's not a maid, not anymore." Clara walked the perimeter of the estate after lunch, past the iron gates and toward the servant cottages that had long since fallen into disuse. One, at the edge of the property, had a broken roof but a door still hanging steady. Inside, she found old furniture covered in sheets, an empty trunk, and a single wooden chest marked with faded ink, "Property of L.B." She opened it slowly. Inside, a pair of shoes, a diary, and a folded page with the Whitmore crest. A contract, unexecuted. It offered Lillian Bennet a portion of the land, a partnership in name only. It had never been signed. Below the offer, a note from Margaret in red ink. "I'm sorry, I wasn't strong enough." Clara sank to the floor. The land she stood on was not just her family's past, it was the site of their silencing. That night, Ethan returned to the East Wing alone. He opened his mother's old bureau, dug through the drawers until he found a velvet pouch hidden beneath a false bottom. Inside was a necklace, a locket. He clicked it open. Inside, 2 photos. One was of his mother. The other was Lillian Bennet, side by side. He sat back, exhaling sharply. He didn't understand everything yet, but he understood enough to know that the story he'd been told was missing entire chapters. He knocked on Clara's door. When she opened it, his face was pale, but his voice steady. "I found this," he said, handing her the locket. "It's yours." She took it slowly, her eyes brimming with something heavier than tears. "This house knew," she whispered, "and it kept her hidden anyway." In the kitchen, the staff murmured about her, some with suspicion, others with awe. One whispered, "She's digging up ghosts." Another replied, "No, she is one." The next day, Clara walked with purpose to the town's archives. She requested access to estate ownership transfers dating back to 1987. She found records of land parcels once belonging to the Bennets, and the documents showing they had been absorbed without signature. She copied everything. Then she called a lawyer, not for revenge, for restoration, the kind that couldn't be ignored. And somewhere, deep within the Whitmore estate, a door swelled slightly in its frame, the air shifting, as if the house itself was bracing. The law office smelled of lemon, polish, and old paper. Clara sat across from the attorney, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't waver. Her name was Denise Avery, and she had grown up hearing about the Bennets, whispered tales, always laced with warnings, never full stories. As she scanned the documents Clara brought, her fingers stilled on one particular page. "This isn't just questionable," Denise said. "It's illegal." Clara didn't blink. "Can we prove it?" Denise looked up, measured. "We can try, but we won't be fighting in courtrooms. We'll be fighting in boardrooms, social halls, and the court of legacy. The Whitmores are woven into this city." Clara nodded slowly. "Then I'll learn to pull threads." Back at the estate, Ethan stepped into the drawing room, finding Caroline flipping through an old photo album. She looked up as he entered, her expression tired but sharp. "You're quiet lately," she said, "which usually means you're either planning something or unraveling? Maybe both, he replied, sitting beside her. She turned the page. Did you know about the locket, about Lillian? No, he admitted. But I know now, and I can't unknow it. She studied his face. So, what are you going to do? He hesitated, then said, I'm going to help her. Caroline laughed once, not cruelly. You really think the family's going to stand by while you torch their legacy? Ethan looked at her, eyes steady. I think it was never ours to protect. Clara spent the next days gathering names, former staff, distant relatives, historians who remembered the Bennett family but never dared to say it aloud. Piece by piece, she built not just a legal claim, but a living memory, one rooted in fact, not fear. A journalist from the local paper caught wind of the investigation. He reached out, asking for comment. Clara agreed to speak, but not yet. Not until everything was ready. Meanwhile, word reached the estate that the Preservation Committee had received a formal petition to reopen the review of the land transfer. Eleanor Whitmore received the letter in the early afternoon. She read it once, then again. Her hand did not tremble, but her throat tightened. They're coming for our name, she muttered. Mrs. Keating, standing nearby, didn't respond, because perhaps it wasn't an attack. Perhaps it was a return. Ethan met Clara in the garden near dusk. The sky was painted in copper and lavender. She handed him a copy of the ownership map. He traced the lines with his finger. The shift from Bennett to Whitmore was too clean, too fast. No sign of negotiation, no approval signatures. It's theft, he said. Clara didn't answer. She didn't have to. He looked at her. When this goes public, they're going to attack you. She nodded. I'm ready. Are you? He asked, softer now. You're not just touching the estate. You're touching Charleston itself. Clara's voice was calm. Then let the city speak for itself. 3 days later, the story broke. Front page, black letters on white paper. Heir or housekeeper, woman claims Whitmore estate built on Bennett legacy. The article detailed the transfer records, the letter from Margaret, the family connection. Clara's name was printed clearly, no aliases, no apologies. The city woke up divided. Some called it a scandal. Others called it long overdue. Eleanor called it betrayal. But Ethan, he called it truth. And for the first time, the Whitmore name wasn't the one being whispered in reverence. It was the Bennett name that echoed down Charleston's oldest streets. The day after the article dropped, the Whitmore estate was surrounded not by protesters or press, but by a silence more unsettling than either. Staff moved slower, doors closed more carefully, and every conversation paused when Clara passed by. Not out of hostility, but uncertainty. She was no longer the maid, no longer the invisible girl with a cloth in her hand. She was the one who had said the unsayable. Ethan walked the halls as if hearing them for the first time. The creaks in the floor, the moan of old wood, the whisper of names carved into family trees with knives. Every portrait he passed looked less like legacy and more like accusation, especially the one of Margaret, his mother, painted just before her death. She'd worn green in the portrait, and a sorrow in her eyes no one had asked about. In the kitchen, Mrs. Keating prepared tea for Eleanor, her fingers trembling just slightly as she added sugar. It's all over the papers, she said, trying to sound neutral. They printed her picture. Eleanor didn't look up. Then they've printed fiction. Ma'am, Keating said, hesitating. She found Lillian's letters. They're real. Eleanor's eyes finally rose, cold and sharp. So is this house, and it remembers who it belongs to. Clara wasn't hiding. She had never planned to. She walked through the downtown streets with her head high, even when eyes followed her. She stopped into the bookstore where she'd once found shelter, now greeted as a guest, not a curiosity. The owner handed her an envelope. "You got mail here. I think it's important." Inside, a letter with a court stamp. The preservation committee had scheduled a hearing. 3 days from now, the city would listen and decide. That night, Ethan joined Clara at the edge of the property, where the estate met the road, and the boundary had once belonged to the Bennets. He had a folder in his hand. "I found something else," he said, handing it to her. Old photographs. Before the boundary lines changed, she flipped through them. A white fence, a sign that read Bennett House, Estee 1912. He watched her closely. They didn't just take the land, they renamed it, redrew the maps, made it look like your family. Never existed. Clara looked up at the estate. "And now I'm going to make sure we never disappear again." Inside the estate, Eleanor sat alone in the music room. She opened the old locket. The photos inside hadn't faded. Lillian and Margaret. She stared at it until her fingers ached from clenching it. Then she set it on the piano and walked away. The following morning, reporters gathered outside the committee offices. Clara stepped out of a black car, flanked by Denise Avery on one side and Ethan on the other. She wore no jewelry, no statement colors. Just black and white, clean lines, the same colors she had worn when she entered the Whitmore home. But this time, she wasn't in uniform. Inside, the room filled fast. City officials, historians, residents, curious elites. The chairwoman of the committee adjusted her glasses and tapped the mic. "Ms. Bennett," she said, "you may begin." Clara stood. No notes, no theatrics. "I'm not here to rewrite history," she said. "I'm here to correct its silence." Her voice didn't waver. She read the letters aloud. She showed the records. She spoke of her mother's erasure, her grandmother's exile, and the broken promises scrawled in margins that no one thought would be read again. The room didn't breathe. She ended simply, "My name is Clara Bennett, and I come from here. I am not reclaiming land. I am reclaiming space in your memory." Applause didn't erupt. But silence did. The kind that means a room just heard the truth and can't unhear it. The aftermath wasn't immediate. It never is in cities like Charleston. Here, change arrives like rainwater through stone, slow, insistent, reshaping everything underneath. Clara stepped out of the preservation committee building into the thick afternoon heat. No cameras flashed, no cheers. But as she walked down the courthouse steps, a woman from the crowd reached out and touched her wrist gently. "My grandmother used to talk about the Bennets," she whispered. "They said you were never coming back." Clara didn't reply. She just nodded. They had said the same thing to her mother. At the estate, the air had shifted. The staff spoke in hushed tones, as if the walls themselves had begun to listen. Mrs. Keating no longer asked Clara to perform chores. She didn't have to. Clara still helped, folding sheets or setting tea when no one else was looking, but not because it was her job, because it was her rhythm. She belonged to this house now, in a way no one else fully did. Upstairs, Ethan stood at the edge of the balcony, watching the moss sway in the trees. He had never imagined himself siding against his own name, but now the name felt thinner, hollowed, like a mask instead of an identity. Clara hadn't just reopened a door, she had walked through it, and he wasn't sure whether to follow or stand aside. Eleanor received the committee's summary in an envelope sealed with the city's crest. She read it slowly, mouth set. In a hard line, the committee had ruled to reinstate the Bennett name in historical records and official documentation regarding the disputed land. The decision wasn't dramatic, it wasn't criminal, but it was public and permanent. She poured herself a drink without ceremony. "They're rewriting us," she said aloud. "No," Caroline said, entering the room. "They're remembering." Eleanor turned sharply. "You think this is just? That girl was a housemaid under our roof." "She was a Bennett before that," Caroline replied. We were just the last ones to see it. In town, reactions rippled unevenly. Some saw it as justice, others as provocation. An op-ed in the Gazette accused Clara of undermining the elegance of Charleston's legacy. Another praised her courage. On the front porch of a hardware store, a pair of old men debated the land's true ownership while sipping sweet tea, like they were judges of time. Clara didn't flinch at the noise. She walked past it, through it. Her face on the front page wasn't just a face, it was a flag, one her ancestors had never been allowed to raise. But the pressure grew. A petition appeared overnight, anonymous, unsigned, calling for the reversal of the decision, claiming historical contamination. Ethan read it twice, fury building. In his throat, he showed it to Clara, jaw clenched. This wasn't just about recognition, he said. It was about threat, and now they're scared. Clara folded the paper calmly. They should be. That evening she returned to the estate garden alone. The angel statue was bathed in gold light from the setting sun. Clara knelt beside it, brushing dirt from the small plaque the city had allowed to be placed, in honor of those written out. Behind her, footsteps. Eleanor, not fast, not nervous, but deliberate. I remember your mother, she said. She was always humming, quiet little melodies in the back corridor. Clara didn't rise. She wasn't supposed to be heard. She loved this house, Eleanor continued, and still she left it. She didn't leave, she was erased. The two women stood on opposite ends of history, not enemies, not yet allies. Eleanor stepped forward. What are you going to do now? Take it from us? Clara stood slowly. No, I'm going to share it. That night, Ethan found Clara in the study, the locket on the desk beside her, and the final page of the petition in her hand. I'm staying, she said before he could speak. I was hoping you would, he replied, not as an heir, not as a maid, but as someone whose story could no longer be silenced, Charleston whispered. It always had, in its brick alleyways, under the live oaks, behind lace curtains where old money breathed slowly and silently. But after the ruling, the city's whispers grew louder. Clara's name came up at luncheons, in pews, at garden parties once filled with blind reverence. Not everyone spoke it with anger, but no one said it lightly. She walked through the market that morning with her head high. A vendor handed her a basket of fresh figs without charging. My grandmother was a Bennett housekeeper once, he said, almost shy. Said your people were proud, not loud, just proud. Clara thanked him softly. It was the quiet acknowledgments that struck deepest, the kind that came without expectation, just truth. Back at the estate, the tension was visible. A letter arrived from the Charleston Historical Society, a formal invitation to speak at the fall symposium on erased families of the Old South. Clara read it twice before folding it back into its envelope. She didn't need applause, but she would not turn away the microphone. Ethan watched the house react around her. The staff tiptoed. His grandmother stayed silent. And yet, Clara never flinched. She moved through the Whitmore halls like someone reclaiming a place, not stealing one. When they passed in the corridor, Ethan stopped her gently. I want to ask you something, he said. Then ask. When this is all done, when the headlines fade, what will you do? Clara looked up, unwavering. I'll stay. Not for revenge, for roots. Meanwhile, Eleanor met with a lawyer. Not the usual estate handler, someone older, deeper in the city's web of legacy preservation. She handed him a file. If she tries to extend this into asset redistribution, I want to be ready. The man looked over the documents. Legally, she has no footing for financial claim unless she proves fraudulent intent. And if she does, then you're no longer protecting legacy, he said. You're defending theft. Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment. Then we changed the conversation. That afternoon, flyers appeared around the historic district, anonymous again, not threatening, but pointed. Not all families are meant to return. Clara found one taped to the bookstore door. She removed it without comment. Denise, her attorney, arrived minutes later with a manila envelope. They're preparing for a fight, she said. Public perception, legal delays, maybe even quiet pressure on the committee. I'm not going away, Clara replied. Denise smiled, weary but impressed. Then we won't either. In the garden that night, Clara wandered alone, carrying a single candle. She placed it beside the statue, lighting the plaque beneath the angel's feet. Then she spoke, not to the wind, not to ghosts, but to herself. You weren't wrong to stay quiet, Mama. But I was right to speak. Inside, Ethan watched her from the window. He saw not defiance, but peace earned through fire. He stepped out onto the porch, joining her quietly. They'll come harder now, he said. I know. And you're not scared? Clara turned to him. I'm not small anymore. A week later, an invitation arrived at the estate. A private gala, Charleston's elite, silent auctions, preservation awards, and for the first time in its history, Clara Bennett's name was on the guest list, not as staff, but as a guest. The gala was held at the Charleston Heritage Hall, a cathedral of old money and curated lineage. White marble floors, mahogany trim, chandeliers imported from France before most of the country had running water. Clara stood at the bottom of the staircase in a black satin dress, simple, elegant, unshakable, not borrowed, not gifted, hers. And when she walked through the double doors, the room didn't gasp. It held its breath. She didn't search for familiar faces. She knew who was watching, who was whispering, who wasn't used to seeing a Bennett cross a threshold as a guest. But she didn't walk like an intruder. She walked like someone who belonged, not despite their silence, but because of it. Ethan arrived shortly after, dressed in charcoal, no tie. His eyes met hers across the room, and in that glance was every unsaid thing between them. He hadn't spoken to Eleanor in 3 days. She hadn't returned his calls, and he knew why. For the first time, the family name wasn't enough to keep the world still. The master of ceremonies began with the usual praises: historical donors, restoration projects, bloodlines preserved. Then came the moment that no one had truly prepared for. Tonight, the speaker said, we acknowledge a name that was once erased, and a woman who made us remember it, Ms. Clara Bennett. No applause followed, just silence, but she stood and walked toward the front, each step a reclamation. Afterward, Clara drifted onto the balcony for air. The city buzzed. Below, streetcars, riverboats, jazz spilling from open windows. The Charleston she had never been allowed to call hers, now unfolding in sound. Caroline approached her, glass in hand. You know they're already trying to find your flaws. Clara didn't look at her. Let them dig. All they'll find is what they buried. Caroline took a sip. You walk like this house is yours. It was once, Clara said, in name, in spirit, maybe not in paper. But I'm fixing that. And if it burns everything down? Clara finally turned. Then maybe it should. Inside, Eleanor sat at a reserved table, untouched drink before her. She watched Clara from a distance, neither scowling nor smiling, just observing. The past had stepped into her ballroom in heels and history, and there was nothing left to deny. One of the board members leaned in. She's not leaving, is she? Eleanor whispered back, no, and neither are we. That night, after the gala, Clara returned to the estate, not out of nostalgia, out of purpose. She entered through the front door, not the servants' gate. No one stopped her. No one asked why. In the east wing, she found the piano untouched. She sat and played. The same melody her mother had once hummed through walls not meant to carry her voice. The house listened, the walls held it, and for the first time it echoed without shame. Later, Ethan joined her, no words needed. They sat in the dark, notes still lingering in the air between them. Outside, the wind rustled the oaks, not as a warning, but as welcome. The next morning, the Whitmore estate felt unusually still, the kind of silence that lingers not from peace, but from anticipation. Clara stood in the east corridor, gazing at the old mural painted above the moulding. A pastoral scene, idyllic and dishonest. She had passed it 100 times, but this was the first time she noticed the shadow in the corner. A brushstroke mistake? Or a hint of truth no one had seen? Downstairs, Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, not reading the paper, not sipping her tea, just waiting. She had summoned Clara, not through a servant, but with a handwritten note delivered to her room. "Breakfast, let's not pretend any more." Clara entered quietly. The sunlight struck the table between them like a blade. No words at first, just the sound of the clock ticking behind them. "I read the committee's transcript," Eleanor said. "It was well spoken." "I didn't write it for elegance," Clara replied. "I wrote it for permanence." Eleanor nodded, setting her fork down. "Do you know what happens next?" "Yes," Clara said. "The estate must acknowledge the Bennet family in its historical ledger, publicly, and I will be present when—" "It does." Eleanor studied her face. "And after that—" Clara met her gaze. "I haven't decided yet." Outside, Ethan paced the garden path, phone buzzing with messages from legal aides and city journalists. Everyone wanted a statement, a quote, a position. He hadn't given one. Not yet. But he knew what mattered more than all that. Clara. And whether she still saw him as a Whitmore or something else entirely. He found her on the back terrace later that morning, hands resting on the railing, eyes set on the water beyond the estate wall. "She wants a truce," he said. Clara didn't move. "She wants control. She's offering space in the archives, a room, a memorial, full inclusion in the family papers." "And in return?" Clara asked. Ethan hesitated. "You drop any further legal pursuit." Clara turned to him slowly. "They want my silence in exchange for space in a drawer." "No," Ethan said. "They're offering acknowledgement." "I don't want acknowledgement," she replied. "I want restoration." Caroline confronted Eleanor that afternoon in the study, where the smell of tobacco and thyme clung to the drapes. "She's not going away," Caroline said. "And you're not winning this quietly." Eleanor closed the folder in front of her. "I'm not interested in winning. I'm interested in surviving." "You can't rebuild legacy on silence anymore," Caroline replied. "Charleston's listening." Eleanor stood, walking to the window. "Then we remind them who we are." That night, Clara received an invitation, hand-delivered, wax seal, elegant cursive. "You are formally invited to speak at the Whitmore Historical Dedication Ceremony. Inclusion of the Bennet lineage has been approved." The Whitmore family. Clara stared at it for a long time. The ink shimmered. The words were flawless, too flawless. She walked through the estate one last time before bed. No uniform, no duties, just memory, thick, silent, alive. She paused at the door of Margaret's old room, then opened it. Inside, everything remained untouched, a shrine to the woman who had known the truth and still stayed silent. Clara whispered, "You almost saved her, but I will." She turned off the light and closed the door. The chairs were arranged in perfect rows on the Whitmore lawn, white cushions gleaming under the soft southern sun. A small podium had been set at the top of the garden steps, framed by magnolia blossoms and trailing ivy. The dedication ceremony was meant to be tasteful, brief, controlled, but everyone present knew it was far more than that. It was an exorcism in disguise. Clara arrived 15 minutes early. No entourage, no fanfare, just her and the silence she had earned the right to break. She wore deep navy, understated but defiant, and pinned to her chest was the magnolia brooch, the one found in her mother's keepsake box, a badge of memory, a symbol of return. Ethan greeted her at the garden gate. "You don't have to. Speak if you don't want to," he said quietly. "I do," Clara replied, "and I'll use their microphone to do it." Inside, Eleanor reviewed her prepared remarks, hands steady, jaw locked. She would not apologize, not publicly, but she would allow history to expand, if only to keep it from collapsing. As guests arrived, city officials, historians, family acquaintances, they filled the air with thin smiles and hushed speculation. Everyone knew what today meant, even if no one dared name it directly. Carolyn took her seat beside Ethan, whispering, "This is going to sting." He nodded. "Good." The ceremony began with formalities, introductions, acknowledgements, pleasantries meant to frame what was coming. Then the MC turned to the crowd. "And now we invite Clara Bennett, direct descendant of Lillian Bennett, to share a few words as we rededicate this estate's archives to include the forgotten lineage that helped shape its very foundation." The silence was immediate. Clara rose, walked to the podium, and looked out over the crowd like someone who had waited generations for this moment. She didn't unfold a speech, didn't look down. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said, "and I come from a family that once stood where you're sitting." The wind stirred lightly. "My mother walked these halls as a servant. Her mother, too, but before them, we were landowners, hosts, neighbors, equals, until we weren't." A few heads bowed, some stiffened. This estate didn't just forget us, it erased us, and now it welcomes us back, not with full hands, but with measured space. She paused, let the silence settle. "So today, I accept that space, not as a favor, but as a beginning." She looked to Eleanor. "And I speak not for vengeance, but for record. Because legacy is not what you protect, it's what you restore." Applause didn't follow, but nods did, and one or two hands clutched hearts in quiet reverence. Clara stepped down. As she passed Eleanor's chair, the older woman met her. Eyes and whispered just loud enough, she would have been proud. Clara didn't stop walking, but her eyes shone. Later, inside the estate, the archives were officially opened. A new cabinet had been added, glass-framed, wood-matched, positioned beside the Whitmore line. Inside, photographs of the Bennett family. Documents, the unsigned contract, the locket. A plaque read, "In recognition of the Bennett family." Erased but not forgotten. That night, Clara sat alone in the music room. She didn't play, she just listened. The house was quieter now, but not with shame, with respect. Ethan joined her at the doorway. "You did it," he said. "No," Clara replied. "I started it." She stood and walked out through the front door. 2 weeks after the ceremony, the air in Charleston changed. Not visibly. The carriages still passed the market, the bells of St. Michael's still rang on the hour. But beneath it all, something had shifted. People began speaking Clara's name not with curiosity or caution, but with context. She was no longer an exception, she was an anchor. And in quiet corners of the city, other names began to surface. Families once silenced, now daring to step into memory's light. But not everyone welcomed the shift. One morning, Clara awoke to find her portrait in the paper again, not under the cultural section, this time in an editorial. The dangers of rewriting Southern grace. It wasn't signed, but she didn't need a name to understand it. It was a warning disguised as nostalgia. At the estate, Eleanor read it with shaking hands. Not because she agreed, but because it meant others were preparing their resistance. "We're losing the narrative," she murmured to Caroline. "No," her granddaughter replied. We're finally sharing it." Ethan stayed silent during the exchange, but later found Clara near the edge of the estate's garden. She was kneeling by the roots of an old oak tree, her fingers tracing initials carved in bark, long faded. "You okay?" he asked. Clara nodded. "I'm just thinking about the things we leave behind, and the things we try to bury." Ethan sat beside her. "That article. They'll keep coming." She looked at him, steady. "I didn't do this for peace. I did it for presence." Days later, Clara received a letter, handwritten, aged, careful. It was from a woman in Savannah who identified herself as Lillian Bennett's cousin. She had kept silent all her life, fearing what the truth might cost her. But now she wanted to contribute to the archives, letters, photographs, stories. Clara met her in person. The woman brought a small tin box. Inside, a photo Clara had never seen. Lillian and Margaret, arms around each other, barefoot in the garden, joyful, unashamed. Behind them, the Whitmore estate, whole and bright. It wasn't just a photograph. It was proof that love had existed and that its erasure had been deliberate. Clara brought it back to the estate. When she showed it to Ethan, he said nothing at first. Then simply, "This goes in the main hall." The act caused unrest. A donor threatened to pull funds from the estate's foundation. A city council member demanded a review of the preservation board's neutrality. Eleanor called a private meeting with Ethan. "You're choosing her over us," she said. Ethan didn't blink. "I'm choosing truth over legacy." Eleanor's voice dropped. "Legacy is what keeps this house standing." "No," he replied. "Truth is what makes it worth standing in." Clara, meanwhile, was preparing her next step. Denise had suggested organizing a public exhibit, not just on the Bennetts, but on other families whose names had been scrubbed from Charleston's registry. It wouldn't be hosted at the estate. It would be held at the City Museum, public, free, permanent. When the announcement came, the reactions were mixed. But the most surprising RSVP arrived unsigned, a simple envelope on her doorstep. Inside, one word: attend. The handwriting was Eleanor's. On the night of the exhibit opening, Clara stood before a small crowd, eyes scanning the faces. Descendants, neighbors, skeptics. She began with a story, not of pain, but of memory. Of her mother humming through her chores, of an angel statue standing guard, of a name whispered at night and never explained. When she finished, no one clapped, but many stayed, to read, to listen, to remember. Back at the estate, Eleanor stood alone in the music room. She didn't touch the piano, but she looked at the chair where Lillian once sat and whispered, "You were right." Not because anyone was listening, but because it was time to stop pretending no one ever had. The exhibit stayed open for weeks. Visitors trickled in daily, some quietly moved, others visibly shaken. What Clara had created was more than a history lesson, it was a mirror. One that forced Charleston to see not only who it celebrated, but who it had tried to forget. She didn't linger in the gallery most days. Her presence wasn't needed anymore. The stories stood on their own. Instead, she returned often to the estate, not as a resident, not as staff, but as someone the house itself seemed to no longer resist. She passed through its halls as if reclaiming oxygen. Each room, once foreign, now belonged to her memories. Even the ones she hadn't lived, but inherited. Ethan met her one afternoon in the drawing room. It had been freshly dusted, the curtains open, sunlight warming the old carpet. "You haven't said what you're doing next," he said, leaning against the fireplace. Clara smiled faintly. "That's because I don't know yet." He stepped closer. "You don't have to know." She looked at him, eyes thoughtful. "I spent so long chasing what was taken, I never thought about what I'd do if I actually got it back." That evening, Eleanor made an unannounced visit to the city museum. No escort, no press, just her and her cane, heels clicking softly against the polished floors. She moved slowly through the exhibit, reading each plaque, pausing at every photo. When she reached the final section, the panel titled "The Letter That Changed Everything," she lingered. There it was, Margaret's handwriting, her admission, her apology, her love. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached out and touched the glass. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, she turned and left without a word. Back at the estate, a new letter arrived, this one addressed to Clara directly. It was official. The Bennet family was approved for historical reinstatement in the National Register. Their land, though long transferred, would be marked and recorded as their original homestead. It wasn't restitution, but it was record. She held the paper in her lap, hands still, heart quiet. This was the moment her mother had dreamed of, feared, and ultimately left behind. Clara wasn't sure if joy was the right word. It felt more like resolution. Ethan found her there on the back steps. He sat beside her. She handed him the letter. He read it, then said, "I'm proud of you." Clara looked out at the trees. "I'm proud of them." The staff began treating Clara differently, not as a superior, not as a relic, but with a respect that felt earned, not instructed. Mrs. Keating brought her tea without being asked. One of the younger housemaids asked to hear the story of the Bennet garden. Clara told it, not like a speech, but like a song, measured, soft, real. The estate itself seemed to breathe differently. Doors that had creaked for decades opened smoothly, windows let in more light. Even the angel statue in the garden seemed to glow more warmly in the late sun. One morning, Ethan walked into the east wing and found Clara pinning something to the wall. A framed photo of her mother, aged gracefully, eyes fierce. Below it a plaque read, "She remembered, now we will too." He stood beside her, then took her hand. Clara let him. No words passed between them, but something older than both of them did. That night, Eleanor called a family meeting. "No staff, no agenda, just blood. I won't fight it anymore," she said, her voice firm if thin. "What's been done is done, but we must choose what kind of Whitmores will be from here forward." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Caroline said, "The kind that don't need to bury the Bennets to feel tall." And for once, Eleanor didn't argue. There was one door in the Whitmore estate no one ever opened, not out of superstition, out of design. It was in the west wing, second floor, behind a faded curtain and a chest-high plant that had long since withered. When Clara first arrived, she hadn't noticed it. Now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Mrs. Keating had once told her in passing that it was Margaret's true study. Not the one on display, but the private one, where real letters had been written and real silence had begun. Ethan brought her the key without a word. She turned it slowly. The door creaked like it hadn't moved in decades. Inside, dust floated like memory. The furniture was covered in sheets, the windows half-shuttered. But beneath it all was something pulsing, not supernatural, just deeply human. Clara stepped inside and peeled back the cover of the writing desk. There, in the center, lay a single book, a ledger, untitled, unindexed, untouched. She opened. It inside were entries, detailed, handwritten, of everything Margaret had tried to keep record of. Land boundaries, payments made to the Bennets, letters returned unopened, proposals never filed. Even a list titled, "Names They Made Me Forget." At the top, Lillian. Clara sat down, flipping page after page, and realized this was more than documentation. It was confession. It was also apology. And it was proof. She carefully photographed every page. When Ethan entered behind her, she didn't need to explain. He looked around the room. "She never let us in here." She was hiding the truth, Clara said, but she wasn't denying it. Not really. "No," Ethan agreed. She was just waiting for someone strong enough to carry it. That night, Eleanor entered the room for the first time since her daughter's death. Clara didn't leave. Neither did Ethan. The three of them stood among the past. No hierarchy, no pretense. "She kept it all," Eleanor whispered. "I thought she destroyed it." "She wanted to," Clara said. "But she didn't. That's something." Eleanor walked to the window, looking out over the garden. "I hated her for what she did," she said, voice flat. "And I hated your mother too, because I knew what they had, and I couldn't understand it." Silence filled the space like mist. Then she turned to Clara. "But I don't hate you." The next day, the documents were submitted to the city archives. The museum requested copies. The historical board moved to recognize Margaret Whitmore's private records as a critical component of the Bennett restoration. This time, no one contested. Clara stood before the committee, Ethan beside her, and watched as her mother's name, Lillian Bennett, was etched permanently into Charleston's register, not in footnotes, not in sidebars, but in the official lineage of the city. Back at the estate, renovations began, not structural, symbolic. The East Wing was converted into a space for public education and historical immersion. The West Study was turned into a reading room. Clara's framed family photos now stood beside Margaret's. And the angel statue, it was restored, not repainted, left weathered, real. At its base, a new plaque read, "Here stood silence, now stands truth." One evening, as the sun fell low, Ethan walked with Clara down the gravel path. "They'll still talk," he said. "Some will never accept it." Clara looked out at the trees. "Then let them speak into the wind. It doesn't change the roots." He smiled. "You ever think about what comes after?" Clara took a breath. "Yeah, I think it might finally be ours to decide." If you've made it this far, let us know what you thought about the story. Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to subscribe to catch all our upcoming stories.